Hello everyone and welcome back to another book review. If you are new here, I post new book reviews on both fiction and nonfiction books almost every single day. So if you're looking to follow book reviews or want book recommendations, then feel free to stick around. Today I am going to be reviewing Language in Danger, The Loss of Linguistic Diversity, and the Threat to Our Future by Andrew Dalby. So this is what the cover looks like. It does have that plastic protective cover that libraries put over it, so it does reflect the light a little bit. That's why it's shiny. So this book, the subtitle sums the topic of this book up quite well, the loss of linguistic diversity. And this is something that I probably discovered when I was early in my teens. I got interested in just the world in general and did a lot of poking around on sites like Wikipedia. And I realized that there were a lot more languages in the world than I thought there was initially. Living in the United States, we maybe learn a foreign language or two in school, and I'm familiar with the big languages, of course. I was exposed to Chinese, Japanese, Spanish, French, German, English, but knowing there was thousands and thousands of languages, many that were spoken by a very small particular group, was very interesting to me, and it became very clear to me at a young age that many of these languages were disappearing quickly as people shifted to speaking a larger language. And this was just something that always interested me. So when I saw this in the library, I decided to check it out. The title makes it quite clear what this book is about. It is about how and why languages disappear, languages that have disappeared in the past, and currently disappearing languages. So languages that are not being spoken as frequently, most importantly, not being passed on to the next generation, so children are not learning to speak it, and languages that only have speakers who are old or very few in number. The book kind of references a lot of past historical events. It references and relies a lot on the Roman Empire and the spread of Latin and how we can see how it interacted with languages and the way it influenced the disappearance of language, but also how Latin itself split into the Latin languages that we know today. So it references quite a bit in the past, and it also focuses on the question of what we stand to lose. So that is overall what this book is about. If I had to talk about the book character overall, I would say this book leans a little bit more towards academic. If we think of like the lay reader or a more casual reader on one end of a spectrum and academic on the other side, maybe an academic paper or a book that's written for specialists, it's not quite in that specialist linguist category where it's unreadable to someone without background knowledge. But it is a little further along that spectrum as it's expecting you to have some knowledge. Sometimes linguistic terms are not explained to someone, leaving the reader either to understand it on their own or look it up on their own, which is just something to note about the book. The real weakness of this book, I think, is something that's very difficult to prevent, and that is the age. So this book was written in 2001, meaning it's over 20 years old. So in 20 years, a lot has changed, especially when we approach the topic of language loss, and languages that are actively disappearing. And so there's a number of ways in which the information presented might be out of date, including which languages still have speakers. So some of these languages that are referenced maybe were listed as having speakers left, but since then the speakers have all passed away. But on the more positive side, perhaps a revitalization attempt has been successful, and we've now increased the number of speakers from what was mentioned in 2001. Also, the author is starting to mention the internet, this new thing that's out there, and maybe it's going to impact things, which we can all agree the internet did have a massive impact on languages, and he can't really fully know the impact. He's just speculating, and I think the internet has had a huge impact, especially with regard to language, both positively and perhaps negatively if we think about the loss of language diversity in that regard. So these three areas are definitely areas that felt quite out of date, but it's nothing that really felt that you couldn't combat per se by just looking things up. So when I ran across the language where the author said maybe it had 7 speakers, I could just reference it online to see what the current state was. He maybe mentioned a revitalization project. I could look up the language and see what the revitalization project had brought about, if the speakers had increased or what was going on. So it's definitely not unreadable. There are just aspects that are out of date, and that's to be expected because this book kind of is a snapshot of a current issue in 2001, the state of linguistic diversity in the world in 2001, so some things are going to be changed. However, if you want a book that maybe addresses more current situation, maybe a book that discusses the state of linguistic diversity in the 2020s, it might be worth looking a little further to see if you can find another book, which has nothing to do with this book. This book was written as a maybe more current issue viewpoint in regard to speakers, revitalization, what languages are spoken where. So it's natural that it will age a little bit as it has. So I don't think it's something I can really, it's not something innate in the book that's worth reducing my rating of it, but it is something to keep in mind because it has aged a little bit from when it was written. One question that the author really posed in this book at one point that I really liked, and a part of the book that I really liked, is when he talked about when a language is dead. I think before reading this book I would have said, well, when there's no one who is a speaker of the language is considered dead. But he says, is a language not dead when there's no group that can speak it? So he talked about, I believe the language was Cornish. It started with a C and it was in England, and there was a woman who died who was listed as like the last speaker who passed away. But did the language die with her because she was the last speaker, or did the language die when her group of friends that spoke it every single day passed away? So she had no one left to speak this language with, therefore the language perhaps was dead. Or maybe the language was dead when there might be, let's say, 20 speakers of a language, people who learn the language fluently as children but haven't spoken it in 50 years. They can recall the language, they can speak it if necessary, but they're not truly speakers of it. Is the language really alive at that point? Or can we say the language has died because no one is speaking it, even if there are people who still remember it? It was just, I think the author did a really good job of pointing out the gradient that exists between a language being like a living language, a language that's still spoken and utilized, the way that Chinese, Japanese, English, German, French, Spanish, all these languages are, to when a language is dead, a dead language, a language that has no more speakers and no one is speaking and no one is using. It's not a switch that flips, but it's more of a gradient that a language kind of moves through. Overall, as I mentioned, this book is not a bad book. It's just a little aged. So definitely, if you're interested in this, I would probably recommend trying to find something a little bit more current. But if your library has this, or if you find this at a book sale, it's not a bad book to pick up because I feel like it gives a lot of background and poses a lot of interesting questions that are still relevant. And you can just look up online or find another book that's more current to discuss some of the more current issues. I actually think that this book would go really well with another book that I read recently. The review is on my channel, The Language of Languages. It is an African writer who is discussing writing in a more minority language, a language with fewer speakers than maybe English or French or one of the other languages that tend to be used heavily on the African continent. And he discusses kind of the role of using that language in his day-to-day to keep it active and the role that translation plays. And I felt like a lot of the topics in that book, which is a more current book, but much more focused on his experience and his work in this language that he speaks, pairs well with some of the concepts that are discussed in this book. So I just felt like those two books went well together. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. If you do read this book and you like it, or you read Language of Languages and you like it, then maybe these two would go well together. So you can consider that. Additionally, if you're looking for something that's really casual and doesn't veer a little bit more academic, maybe find something that's a little lighter. But overall, this was a very enjoyable book. I had a good time reading it, and I definitely want to go back to my library now and see if there's something that's a little bit more current on linguistic diversity, because I think that would be very interesting to read. Overall, 3 stars. I really enjoyed it. If you've read this book or have any thoughts on this book, please let me know. I would love to hear it in the comments below. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.